What do you do when your enemy takes your ship in broad daylight in front of the entire world and there is nothing you can do to stop it? That is the exact question Iran's military leadership was forced to answer this year. And the answer they gave has pulled the world closer to a wider war than most people realize. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is not over. It is still unfolding right now, this week, and I will be tracking every twist as it happens. Let's rewind to where this all began, because you cannot understand the ship, the standoff, or what came after without understanding how this war started in the first place. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint military campaign against Iran. Fighter jets and missiles hit military sites, government facilities, and infrastructure across the country in a single coordinated wave. But the strike that changed everything was not against a building or a base. It was against a man. Israeli and American intelligence tracked down and killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, the single most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic since its founding decades ago. Think about what that means for a moment. This was not a proxy skirmish. This was not a limited strike meant to send a message. This was the assassination of the top of Iran's entire command structure, a move with almost no precedent in modern history. Nations do not usually go after each other's supreme leaders. When they do, there is no walking it back. For decades, the assumption in global politics was that certain lines simply did not get crossed, that the very top of a government, however hostile, remained untouchable because the consequences of removing that person were too unpredictable to risk. That assumption died on February 28th. And once a line like that is crossed, every actor in the region has to quietly recalculate what else might now be on the table. Allies of Iran watched closely. Rivals of the United States watched even closer. Because if a supreme leader can be removed, the old rules everyone assumed were fixed suddenly look a lot more negotiable. Iran's response was immediate and defiant. Within days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow stretch of water separating Iran from Oman, was closed. Not closed to enemies, closed to everyone. Warnings went out over open radio channels to every ship in the region. No vessel passes through these waters without Iran's permission. That single sentence sent a shockwave through the global economy that most people at home never fully connected to what was happening on their own gas pump. Understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. It is a corridor of water so narrow you could almost see one coast from the other at its tightest point, and yet roughly a quarter of the entire planet's seaborne oil passes through it, along with a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas. Shutting it down does not just hurt Iran's neighbors. It touches every economy on Earth that runs on fuel, which is to say, all of them. For weeks, that narrow strip of water became the most dangerous shipping lane on the planet. Iranian forces laid sea mines, they boarded merchant vessels, a tugboat was sunk, more than a dozen commercial ships were damaged, some abandoned entirely by their crews. Sailors died. Ordinary merchant seamen, people with no stake in this war at all, became casualties of a fight between nations they had nothing to do with. Shipping companies began routing around the region entirely, adding weeks and enormous costs to global trade. By early April, both sides were exhausted enough to try diplomacy. On April 8th, Pakistan brokered a ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, meant to last 2 weeks, while negotiators worked toward something more permanent. But a ceasefire on paper and a ceasefire in reality are two very different things. Within days, it was already being violated by both sides. Trump extended it anyway, buying time, hoping talks in Islamabad could produce a real breakthrough. They did not. The Islamabad talks collapsed. And when diplomacy fails in a war this large, someone has to decide what comes next. Washington's answer was economic strangulation. On April 13, 2026, the United States announced a full naval blockade of Iran. Not a warning, not a threat. An actual blockade enforced by warships. More than half a dozen guided missile destroyers spread out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait, backed by the firepower of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, sitting offshore. The order was simple and absolute. Nothing moves in or out of Iranian waters unless the United States allows it. America's top military officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, laid out the rules publicly before a single ship was stopped. Warning shots first. If a vessel still refused to comply, board it and seize it by force. There was no ambiguity left. Every captain in the region now knew exactly what would happen if they tested the line. Put yourself in the position of a shipping company for a second. You have cargo on the water, insurance premiums already climbing because of the war risk, and now a foreign navy telling you that entering a stretch of ocean your ships have sailed for decades could get your vessel boarded or disabled. Most companies made the obvious choice. They rerouted, delayed, or simply waited it out in port. That is exactly the pressure the blockade was designed to create, not just against Iran's navy, but against the entire economic bloodstream that keeps the country running. A blockade does not need to stop every ship to work. It only needs to make every captain afraid enough to stop trying. 6 days later, on April 19th, one ship decided to test it anyway. Her name was the Touska, sometimes written Touska in early reports, a container vessel roughly the length of 3 football fields, sailing under the Iranian flag, operated by a subsidiary of Iran's state shipping line and sanctioned by the United States since 2019. She was heading toward Bandar Abbas, Iran's main commercial port, attempting to pass straight through the blockade the U.S. Navy had just put in place. For 6 hours, the standoff dragged on. Warnings were issued. The Touska kept moving. And then the American destroyer USS Spruance did something calculated and deliberate. It did not try to sink the ship. It fired directly into the vessel's propulsion system, crippling her engines with surgical precision, leaving her dead in the water, but intact. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A sunk ship sends one message. A disabled ship, sitting helpless in open water while the entire world watches, sends a completely different one. It says, "We could have destroyed you, and we chose not to, because we wanted you to feel exactly how powerless you are right now." Within the hour, Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit launched from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli. Under cover of darkness, they fast roped down onto the drifting deck of a ship that, hours earlier, had belonged entirely to the Islamic Republic of Iran. CENTCOM released grainy night vision footage of the operation to the world's media almost immediately. There was no attempt to keep this quiet. The opposite, in fact. This was meant to be seen. Picture that scene for a second. A crew that had spent 6 hours refusing to stop suddenly plunged into darkness and silence as the engines died beneath their feet. Then, the sound of rotor blades closing in from above, and armed Marines dropping onto the deck of a ship that, moments earlier, they had believed was still under their own nation's control. There was no gunfight, no prolonged resistance. It was fast, disciplined, and almost clinical, which in some ways made it more unsettling to watch than a violent confrontation would have been. A crew simply woke up to find their ship and their fate no longer belonged to them. By dawn, American forces controlled the Touska completely. Now, here's a quick favor before we go further into what Iran did about all this. If this kind of deep, connect-the-dots breakdown is useful to you, tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening in the world instead of just scrolling past headlines. Iran's reaction was immediate, and it was furious. Officials branded the seizure an act of piracy. The foreign ministry called it illegal and brutal. State media pushed the framing. Hard, a sovereign nation's vessel stolen on the open sea by a foreign military. And underneath the outrage was something more revealing. Iranian officials admitted, almost unusually openly, that they were holding back a stronger retaliation because crew members' families were reportedly aboard the ship, and Tehran did not want to risk their safety while planning a response. That single admission tells you more about Iran's position than any angry statement could. A government that will openly explain why it's hesitating as a government boxed into a corner. It wanted to look strong for its own people. It also could not afford to trigger an escalation it might not survive. That tension, wanting to hit back while knowing it might not be able to absorb what comes next, would define almost everything Iran did for the rest of this war. Every government facing military defeat eventually reaches this same crossroads. Respond too weakly, and your own population starts to question whether you can protect them at all. A dangerous question for any regime to leave unanswered for too long. Respond too aggressively, and you risk provoking a level of retaliation that could threaten the survival of the government itself. There is no comfortable option in that position, only a series of choices that each carry their own kind of danger. Watching how Iran navigated that narrow path over the following weeks tells you almost everything you need to know about how weakened its position had actually become. And then investigators started digging into where the Touska had actually been. Before heading toward the Strait of Hormuz, the ship had spent time docked in southern China, reportedly stopping at a port in Zhuhai more than once in the weeks before the seizure. Posts circulating on Chinese-language platforms after the capture claimed the vessel was carrying large quantities of chemical compounds, including ammonium, perchlorate and related materials, substances that can be used in missile propellant production. It's important to be honest here. Those specific claims about the cargo have not been independently verified, and serious analysts have treated them with caution. But the broader picture, an Iranian-flagged U.S.-sanctioned vessel with ties to Chinese ports, attempting to break through a wartime blockade toward Iran's main port, was enough to raise a much bigger question that has hung over this entire conflict. How deep does the network supporting Iran's war machine actually go? Reports even surfaced that President Trump personally wrote to Chinese leader Xi Jinping, urging him not to let Chinese entities support Iran during the conflict. Whether or not every detail of the Touska's cargo is ever fully confirmed, the seizure exposed just how tangled global supply chains have become, and how a single ship can turn into a flashpoint between 3 major powers at once. This is the part of modern warfare that rarely makes it into the headlines, but matters just as much as any missile strike. Wars are no longer fought only with weapons. They're fought with shipping manifests, port records, insurance filings, and banking transactions. A container ship that docked in the wrong port at the wrong time can become as diplomatically explosive as a fighter jet crossing a border. The Touska was never just a cargo vessel. By the time she reached the Strait of Hormuz, she had already become a symbol of every unanswered question hanging over this war. Who is quietly helping Iran stay in the fight? And how far are those countries willing to go before they get caught doing it in public? Trump didn't wait for a formal briefing to announce what had happened. He posted about it directly, framing it in blunt, simple terms. Iran was warned, Iran refused, and the Navy disabled the ship. No diplomatic softening, no hedging. It was a message aimed at more than just Tehran. It was aimed at every captain who might consider testing. The blockade next, at Beijing, at Moscow, and at every government watching to see whether America's threats in this region actually meant anything. They did. Iran, meanwhile, was left with an old and familiar playbook, because directly confronting American warships was never realistically on the table. That kind of move risks a level of retaliation Iran's military, already worn down by weeks of strikes, could not survive. So instead, within days of losing the Touska, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy seized 2 foreign-flagged tankers near its own coastline and pulled them into Iranian waters. The official reason given was vague, something about maritime violations. The real purpose was obvious to anyone watching. Leverage, bargaining chips. A way to say, we can take ships too, even if the ships in question had nothing to do with the original fight. It's a pattern analysts have watched Iran run for more than a decade, going back to earlier standoffs in these same waters. Grab a foreign vessel, hold the crew, use it as pressure whenever you feel cornered. The problem is that this tactic works differently depending on your position of strength. When it's one option among many, it's a credible threat. When it becomes your main tool because so many other options have been stripped away, it starts to look like exactly what it is. Desperation dressed up as defiance. Iranian officials went even further, floating the idea of charging transit fees and demanding military coordination for any ship passing through the strait, essentially trying to claim unilateral control over one of the most important waterways on the planet, even as their navy was actively being dismantled piece by American strikes. It was bravado. Everyone watching understood it as bravado. But bravado still has a purpose. It's aimed at a domestic audience that needs to believe their government hasn't been humiliated. Let's talk about the scale of what was actually happening in these waters, because the numbers involved are almost hard to process. Since the blockade took effect, U.S. Central Command reported intercepting more than 80 commercial vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian waters. Only a handful managed to get through. Independent maritime tracking firms estimated that out of what would normally be hundreds of transits through this region, barely 24 ships made it past the blockade untouched. That is not a partial disruption. That is close to a complete economic seal. The United States estimated the blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day. Not per week, per day. Compounding, with no end in sight, against an economy that was already fragile before any of this began. Try to picture what $500 million a day actually means for a country. It's not just lost oil revenue, it's medicine that doesn't get imported. It's factories running short on parts they can no longer bring in. It's currency losing value faster than families can adjust their budgets. Economic warfare doesn't show up as a single dramatic headline, the way a missile strike does. It shows up slowly, in empty shelves, in longer lines, in a government quietly running out of options to keep its own population fed, employed, and calm. That is the kind of pressure that doesn't just weaken a military. It weakens the foundation a government stands on. And Iran wasn't just losing ships and money. It was losing its ability to fight back at all. In the weeks following the Touska seizure, American strikes against Iranian military targets intensified sharply, hitting radar installations, air defense systems, drone storage sites, and naval infrastructure. American officials said plainly that the goal was to neutralize Iran's Navy and Air Force as functional threats. One senior defense official put it bluntly, the drones Iran kept showing off in state media broadcasts were essentially museum pieces, propaganda props with little real combat value left, while the actual functioning arsenal had already been stripped away. Now, before we go further into how the human cost of this war reached all the way into American households, I want you to do something different than a normal like or subscribe. Drop one word in the comments right now. Which side do you think is actually winning this war? Not who's louder, who's actually winning. I read every single one, and I want to see what you think before I tell you where the evidence points. Because the human cost here is not abstract, and it did not stay contained to the Gulf. Civilians in Iran were living through this in the most direct way possible. Near Bushehr, home to one of the country's nuclear power facilities, residents activated air defenses as explosions shook nearby neighborhoods. In Khuzestan province, a hospital had to relocate more than 200 patients after strikes damaged the building and blew out windows across the district. 200 patients moved in the middle of an active war, because the line between civilian infrastructure and military targets in Iran is often non-existent. Coastal cities like Chabahar and Kish reported strikes as well, though Iranian state media stayed deliberately vague about the true scale of the damage. No government wants to broadcast the full extent of its own losses. The cost ran in both directions. The Pentagon confirmed American service members were killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes, including a staff sergeant from New York, who died in an attack on a U.S. base in Jordan, her identity not officially confirmed until weeks later. A delay that drew real criticism over how the military was handling casualty disclosures during this war. Reports suggested close to 100 additional American troops suffered injuries ranging from minor to serious, with the true numbers trickling out slower than officials first admitted. And then there's the cost that landed on ordinary people who have never set foot near the Persian Gulf. Gas prices in the United States climbed to their highest levels in years, with American drivers paying close to 40% more at the pump than before this war began. That is not a number that stays in a headline. That is a number that shows up every time someone fills their tank, every time a delivery truck passes on higher shipping costs, every time a grocery bill creeps up a little further than it should. A war fought over control of a shipping lane on the other side of the world reached directly into family budgets back home. Through all of this, Iran's public position never bent. Officials insisted there would be no return to the negotiating table. Even as their navy lost ships, their cities absorbed strikes, and their economy bled hundreds of millions of dollars a day. That contradiction, a government simultaneously humiliated and defiant, is worth sitting with for a second, because it is exactly the kind of position that makes a regime most unpredictable. Not when it's winning, not when it's clearly beaten, and ready to give in, but when it's losing and refuses to say so out loud. That's when miscalculation becomes policy. And that paradox is exactly where this story takes its strangest turn, because the front lines of this war did not stay confined to Iran and the Gulf. By late July, Iran found itself facing pressure from a direction almost nobody predicted. Ukraine struck an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, killing one person and injuring several others. Iran's foreign ministry called it an act of illegal aggression that could not go unanswered. On the surface, this made no sense. Ukraine is fighting for its own survival against Russia, thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf. Why would it suddenly start striking Iranian ships in a sea most people couldn't point to on a map? The answer traces back to Iran's long military relationship with Moscow. For years, Iran has supplied Russia with drones and missiles used in the war in Ukraine, and in exchange, Russia has offered military and diplomatic support. That relationship made Iranian assets fair targets in Ukraine's fight for survival. It's a stark reminder of how connected these conflicts actually are beneath the surface. And it raised a genuinely frightening possibility for Iran. A two-front war, fighting the United States in the Arabian Sea while also facing hits from Ukraine in the Caspian, at the exact moment its military had the least capacity to handle either. Most nations struggle to sustain even one active front. Iran, at this point in the war, was staring at the possibility of two on opposite sides of the country, against opponents with completely different strengths. The United States could bring overwhelming naval and air power to bear in the Gulf. Ukraine, battle-hardened after years of grinding warfare with Russia, had developed exactly the kind of precision drone and missile capability that makes distant naval targets vulnerable in ways they never used to be. Neither front alone would have been comfortable for Iran. Both at once was close to a nightmare scenario, and it revealed something uncomfortable about how far this conflict had already spread beyond its original borders. Iranian officials went further, floating the idea of demanding transit fees and requiring military coordination from any vessel passing through the strait, essentially trying to claim unilateral control over one of the most important waterways on the planet, even while their own military was being dismantled piece by piece. Some commentators inside Iran even reached back to older disputes between the United States and Venezuela, where American forces seized sanctioned oil, tankers, and faced similar accusations of piracy. The comparison was not flattering. It placed Iran alongside a growing list of sanctioned nations watching their ships taken by an American Navy that increasingly treats these operations as routine, closer to scheduled maintenance than to acts of war. There was also a financial weapon in play that, in some ways, cut deeper than any missile strike could. The Trump administration announced that damages caused by attacks tied to Iran-backed forces, including escalated Houthi strikes on shipping in the Red Sea, would be paid for using Iran's own frozen assets, funds the United States has held for years, estimated by some analysts at well over $100 billion. Think about the mechanism here. Iran-linked proxies damage a ship. Insurance claims get filed. And the United States pays those claims out of Iran's own frozen wealth. Every successful attack by Iran's allies ends up shrinking Iran's own accessible fortune. Iran's foreign minister called it a dangerous precedent, warning that if frozen state assets can be used this way, no nation's money is truly safe anywhere. It was a rare moment of candor from Tehran, an admission that Washington had found a form of leverage Iran had no real way to counter. You cannot threaten your way out of your own money being spent against you. Compare that to a missile strike for a moment. A missile destroys something physical, a building, a runway, a piece of hardware, and it can often be rebuilt or replaced given enough time and money. A financial mechanism like this one doesn't destroy anything visible. It simply drains a number lower every single time an ally makes a move on Iran's behalf. There's no rubble to show on television, no dramatic footage to release, just a bank balance getting smaller month after month, with no way to stop it short of ending the fighting altogether. In some ways, that kind of pressure is harder for a government to fight back against than a warplane because there's no target to strike back at. You can't send a missile at a spreadsheet. Meanwhile, diplomacy kept collapsing under its own weight. Back in June, both sides quietly signed a memorandum of understanding, an agreement that was supposed to include unfreezing some Iranian assets in exchange for real de-escalation. As of this moment, neither side has fully honored it. Both governments seem to believe they can still extract more by holding out. Both are betting the other side blinks first. Mediators from Oman and Pakistan have shuttled between capitals, trying to build a workable framework for shipping traffic through the strait. And while there have been handshakes and joint statements, nothing has produced an agreement solid enough to actually hold. The blockade itself was lifted once in late May, after a round of negotiations, only to be reimposed weeks later once the ceasefire it depended on collapsed again. Here is where things stand right now, as of the middle of August. And this is important because a lot of coverage of this war is already outdated within days. The naval blockade is back in force. U.S. Central Command says it has redirected dozens more commercial vessels and disabled or boarded several others under the reimposed blockade. Iran's negotiating team has been in talks with Oman, reportedly trying to establish temporary arrangements over the strait that would leave Iran holding meaningful influence over the waterway for a period of months, while Washington and Tehran continue to trade mixed signals about whether a lasting deal is close or still far away. President Trump, just this past week, said publicly that he expects to declare some form of control over the Strait of Hormuz fairly soon, language that stunned even close observers of this conflict, given that the strait runs through sovereign Iranian and Omani waters. Whether that becomes an actual policy or turns out to be another piece of pressure, tactics aimed at forcing Iran back to the table, is still unclear. What is clear is that neither side has fully stepped back from the brink. Strikes are still being exchanged. Iran has accused Qatar of holding captured pilots from the earliest days of the war, a claim Doha has firmly denied. Hezbollah and Israel continue trading accusations over ceasefire violations in Lebanon, a conflict that opened up almost as a side effect of this larger war and is never fully closed. Look at the pattern of the last 4 months, and you can see how fragile every single one of these arrangements has been. A ceasefire gets announced. It gets extended once, sometimes twice. Then something happens, a strike, a seized ship, a broken promise over frozen funds, and the entire framework collapses, forcing negotiators to start rebuilding trust from almost nothing. This has happened not once, but repeatedly, which tells you something important about the actual state of this relationship. It's not that peace is impossible, it's that neither government currently trusts the other enough to take the first real step without some kind of guarantee, and right now, nobody seems able to offer one that both sides will accept. Before we get into what all of this actually means for where this war goes next, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this. Bookmark this video. Not because I'm asking you to watch it twice right now, but because this story is going to keep changing. And when the next major move happens, whether it's a real ceasefire or another strike, I want you to be able to come back and see exactly how we got there. That's the only way any of this actually makes sense, by watching it unfold in order instead of catching random headlines out of context. So let's step back and look at the shape of this whole conflict, because when you zoom out far enough, the seizure of one cargo ship back in April stops looking like an isolated incident and starts looking like exactly what it was: the opening move in a much longer fight over who controls the most important waterway on Earth. Think back for a second to what this region looked like before any of this started. The Strait of Hormuz was simply background noise in most people's understanding of the world, a name mentioned occasionally in the news, rarely explained, rarely felt. Oil tankers moved through it constantly, quietly, without most of the planet giving it a second thought. That normalcy is now gone, and it may not come back the way it was before, regardless of how this war eventually ends. Once a choke point like this becomes a battlefield, insurers remember, shipping companies remember, and governments start building contingency plans that assume it could happen again. Nearly 6 months in, the American military has systematically dismantled Iran's conventional navy and air force. Officials describe both as effectively neutralized, a description that would have sounded absurd about a country that, less than 2 years ago, commanded one of the most capable asymmetric military networks in the Middle East, with proxy forces stretching from Yemen through Lebanon into Iraq. That regional network has been Iran's actual strategy this entire time. When you can't fight directly, you lean on allies who can strike on your behalf while your own forces try to regenerate in the background. That's exactly what played out when Houthi forces escalated attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, pushing global oil prices past $100 a barrel for the first time in years. It's exactly what's playing out with Hezbollah's tension against Israel and Lebanon. And it's exactly the strategic logic that turned an unrelated war in Ukraine into another front Iran now has to worry about. The bigger question underneath all of it is whether Iran's leadership is exhausted enough to genuinely want this to end, or too politically cornered at home to be the side that asks for peace first. Because right now, publicly, Iranian officials keep insisting that Washington will not be the one to decide when this war concludes, that Iran alone holds that power. It's a bold claim from a government whose navy has been gutted, whose ports have spent months under blockade, and whose economy has bled. Staggering amounts of money every single day this war has continued. But that message was never really meant for Washington. It was meant for Iran's own population and its remaining regional allies, because regimes survive wars. They're clearly losing militarily as long as they can convince their core supporters the fight isn't over yet. So where does that leave us? A war that started with the assassination of a supreme leader has evolved into an economic siege measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars per day, a diplomatic relationship defined by broken agreements on both sides, a blockade that keeps getting lifted and reimposed depending on which side feels it has more leverage that week, and a president now openly floating the idea of American control over one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. Add in a completely separate front opening against Ukraine and Iran-backed forces stretching from Yemen to Lebanon still active, and you start to understand why analysts keep describing this as one of the most volatile and unpredictable conflicts in decades, not because either side is clearly winning, but because neither side seems able to walk away. For the sailors who were aboard the Touska that night, for the Marines who fast-roped onto her deck in the dark, and for every merchant crew now wondering whether their ship could be next, this stopped being a distant headline a long time ago. It's a live, ongoing situation, still shaping oil prices, still shaping diplomacy, still costing real lives on more than one side. And whatever happens next, whether it's the ceasefire finally holding or another escalation nobody saw coming, it's going to keep reaching further than most people expect, all the way to gas pumps, grocery bills, and dinner table conversations in countries that have nothing to do with the Persian Gulf at all. It's worth remembering that wars like this rarely end with a single dramatic moment. There is no single battle that decides everything, no one signature on one piece of paper that makes the fear disappear overnight. Instead, they grind down slowly through blockades that get lifted and reimposed, through ceasefires that hold for a few weeks and then quietly fall apart, through statements from both sides insisting they haven't lost, right up until one day the fighting simply stops making sense to continue. We may already be watching the early stages of that slow grind right now, or we may be watching the calm before something far larger. Nobody on either side of this conflict actually knows which one it is yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment so important to pay attention to. 6 months ago, almost none of this seemed possible. A supreme leader assassinated, a container ship disabled and boarded in front of the world's cameras, a blockade costing $500 million a day, a completely unrelated war in Ukraine suddenly reaching into the Caspian Sea. If this much has already happened in half a year, it should make all of us cautious about assuming we know how the next 6 months will unfold. History tends to repeat the same lesson in conflict after conflict, and people keep forgetting it anyway. The side that looks strongest on paper, with the bigger navy, the bigger economy, and the clearer military advantage, does not always get to decide when a war truly ends. Wars end when both sides, for their own separate reasons, decide continuing costs more than stopping. Right now, only one side of this conflict has publicly admitted that reality out loud. The other keeps insisting it hasn't reached that point yet. Whether that's genuine confidence or simply the last version of the story a cornered government can tell its own people is something only time is going to answer. So here's the real question worth sitting with. A war that began with the death of one man has already pulled in 3 major powers, a global shipping crisis, and a fight over frozen billions of dollars. If neither side is willing to be the one that blinks first, what does an actual ending to this war even look like? And is anyone, on either side, truly prepared for what comes after? Tell me what you think happens next. And if you want to be here when the answer actually arrives, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is not finished, and neither are we.